Welcome to L'Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with the practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life.
Our guest today is Dori Coblentz. Dori, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So we just kind of wanted to start out this interview a little bit by just kind of getting your background for our audience. So if you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started in historical martial arts.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a lecturer in technical communication at Georgia Tech now, and I took a little bit of a roundabout way to get there. I got my PhD from Emory University in English, and as part of that, my dissertation research, I looked at fencing manuals alongside Ben Jonson and Shakespeare's drama. So eventually I realized that fencing manuals are a form of technical communication, and I was a little bit more interested in the fencing manuals than in the Ben Jonson and the Shakespeare. So here I am. Now I get to work on fencing manuals full-time, because I'm doing a history of technical communication focus with my next project. I started fencing back in the early 2000s. There was an SCA group that met on my college campus, so I dropped by a few times there. I didn't really get a lot of traction with it then, though. I tend to be pretty competitive, and I was getting really frustrated because I didn't feel like I was getting better at fencing. It was a little bit too unstructured for me. But then a few years later, we moved to the Bay Area. My husband and I, David, moved to the Bay Area. And we had a bad roommate situation, so we had to get out of the house for longer periods of time. And then I started fencing in an SCA group out there, and started to get a little bit more interested in, at least socially, but then I didn't really feel like I owned it as a hobby until I began some Italian foil classes through a local adult education center. And that kind of structure, the ideals, like the way that the material was presented, really helped me dig into fencing and own it as my own hobby instead of just something that I went to because other people were going. So that makes me very interested in the relationship between, say, form, like the form of a lesson, how formal a lesson is, to structure, and creativity, which is something that we've explored a lot.
So that's, can I jump in on this? This is really interesting here. So you said you did kind of, your background was in English as technical communication or technical communication forms of literature. Is that right?
Right. So there's kind of a movement, like especially in the 80s and 90s, coming out of some of the the Marxist wing of criticism that began to be interested in non-elite forms of writing. So instead of just reading like Philip Sidney, instead of just reading Spencer and Shakespeare, right, let's look at technical manuals. Let's look at other things. So one of my the people who was very formative when I was learning at San Jose State came out of that tradition. But yeah, so it's a literary tradition, but it's a literary tradition that specifically is interested in questions of class and therefore looks at technical communication artifacts.
Okay, cool.
That makes sense.
That's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, that is. So you've taken that same sort of mode and ethos and sort of morphed it into your own academic studies, but also incorporated your passion and your hobbies into it with some of the papers that you've written. What is sort of combining those two things together been like?
It's been really, really great. Like, it's taken a long time to get there. So I spent probably the first 5 or 10 years of my career trying to sneak my ideas about literature in and make people think that they were very interesting before saying, oh, and look, we can see all of these ideas in fencing, and fencing can help us read these things. Because there is still kind of a certain amount of snobbiness, I think, in literary studies, where you can't bring your hobbies to work, or it makes you seem like a dilettante if you are. So I had to learn about 16 different ways to explain or justify why fencing can help us think about literature. But I mean, it was good for me overall. And I think now, with my current position at Georgia Tech, I can teach rhetoric and ethics and technical communication, and I can do classes that focus on the history of rhetoric that let me just bring in those resources more. I just did a design analysis assignment for them where I sent them all to the Wiktenauer And I told them to look at all the 16th and 17th century manuals, pick one, and then write a design analysis based on it. And ideally to pick one that's not in a language that they could read, so they could really focus on things like margins and layout. And it was really, really interesting. I'll tell you, like, they didn't pick the ones that I thought they would. But yeah, I mean, that's just an example of being able to do the two things together. And I like my research to build on my teaching, and my teaching to build on my research as much as I can.
So how do you, when you sort of apply these two things together and you're incorporating fencing with looking at it from a technical manual perspective, and especially from like a class perspective, do you see a difference like between somebody like Marazzo or Manciolino, for example, who and somebody like Vigiani, where the disparity between the people that they're writing for is pretty great, right? Like Marazzo's writing for Guido Rangone, Manciolino, I guess, is writing more for the Spanish court, so I guess he's writing for sort of a higher power, if you will. But you know, when it comes to writing for somebody who's like a duke or a count, or maybe like a minor lord versus somebody who's writing for an emperor, or
well, maybe we should actually back up on this, because it sounds like Dori has a pretty great perspective on this. Who do you think these manuals were written for? Let's not put the cart in front of the horse.
Yeah. Actually, that's exactly where I wanted to go, Stephen. That's a really interesting question, and I think that's part of what is so. That is actually more what drew me to looking at the Bolognese tradition. I mean, I have gone to a couple classes. I love how it feels. It's fun, but it's not like in my. It's not one of my personal like areas of expertise in terms of fencing, teaching fencing, or fencing myself. But I love the tradition as a place for where early print technology intersects with schools, and it intersects with schools that do have this kind of range in who they're teaching. So it's not like, you know, Fabris, who's off, you know, in the King of Sweden's court. And it's not like Sweetnam, who's just kind of, you know, scrambling to get people in Portsmouth to buy his how-to book. Right. So it's this kind of mixed audience in terms of class. And I think one thing that is really, really interesting about print in that time period, in the early 16th century, especially like in Germany and northern and central Italy, is the destabilization of audience. So with print technology, your audience just expands exponentially, right. And you no longer have the same kind of control over who's going to read it, when they're going to read it, where they're going to read it. So even though I think it's clear that they're kind of they're appealing to like this patronage system too. So they really are hoping that they'll be able to get some traction out of dedicating these books to these people. It seems clear that there is also, at least in Vigiani's case, it seemed clear that there's also this expectation of like the split audience. So there's the broader reader. There's going to be some income from people who are buying these books, because apparently there are people who want to buy these books. And I honestly just really admire these authors in this tradition, because they're kind of going out on a limb here. You know, they're really experimenting with this new print medium and hoping that somebody out there will buy it. So to me, like generically, in terms of genre, the Bolognese texts are just kind of exciting and all over the place in some really interesting ways. But yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, because it's not like it doesn't matter who the works are dedicated to, and it doesn't matter who the historical figures that they're kind of interlocuting with. I just think that part of what makes this tradition particularly interesting is the new awareness of how big and how weird your audience is as an author. And the strategies that people are trying to figure out about how to deal with that in the early days of print, before they really have some of these conventions that get a little bit, you know, by the time you're reading like, you know, Marcelli, right? You have much more conventional works. There's much more conventional use of tables of contents, of, you know, indices, of chapters, of subheadings. But in this early moment, you know, it can be all over the place.
So one of the things I just wanted to kind of interject this in here, and on the technical communications front as well. One of the things I always thought was really interesting about Manciolino is the fact that he, in print, lays down what is essentially a system that unifies body, time, motion, and weapon. And it's very different than the work that he would have been familiar with that was available before of Monty, which is essentially like some dude's bag of tricks, right? So is it reasonable to say that Manciolino represents sort of a quantum leap in terms of systematically presenting information to an unskilled fencer?
Yeah, I think that's a great comparison. And I think that we don't study Manciolino, we as in like scholars of rhetoric and the history of rhetoric, we don't study Manciolino, and really we should be, because of the way that he's experimenting. I think I agree with you, he's kind of undertaking this enterprise that's quite different than what we see with Monty. And the way that he is experimenting with the kind of intermingling of his prose and the verse and the technical, like all those different stylistic registers. I love how he continually has these apostrophes that talk about, satyrs who are hunting nymphs, and it's talking about all of these different really poetic kind of expressions. But then, oh no, I have to just write a boring old fencing manual, and you can't do that. So he's performing using this very high high stylistic register to write this manual, and then as he's actually writing the manual, then as he's writing it, and I think it's also mirroring what's happening with the assaulti, right? Because you're springing to out of distance before you really do those embellishments, before you really do those ornamental movements. So he's out of distance in a way when he's apostrophizing about satyrs and nymphs, and then you come back into measure, and then that's when you use more of the traditional, clear, technical writing sort of stylistic register. So I think he's super interesting for how he plays with both embodied movement and also with the verbals of what he's trying to do with the manual, and he blends them in those ways.
Cool.
Yeah. So with somebody like Marozzo, how do you think that Marozzo became as popular as he did, given that he is very deliberate in the fact that he wasn't writing for a broader audience? How do you think that came about?
I mean, I wonder how much of it was just the novelty, right? And how much of it is just he's beginning to, he's right at the beginning of some of that print audience. So maybe, and also he's writing it later in life, later in his career, so he maybe has a wide personal network. And also there's just kind of the vagaries of what gets preserved and what doesn't get preserved. So maybe there are other copies of other fencing treatises that were really well written that we don't have a hold of. But I wonder if it's some combination of having a really broad network of students and ex-students kind of being the first on the scene, or one of the first on the scene for these printed works that have broader distribution. And also, I think that there is just something that is kind of more fun and personal and warm in his style that I think can really be appealing.
The pictures really probably didn't hurt either. Yeah,
pictures didn't hurt. Right. Poor Manciolino. I love Manciolino, and yet his pictures are just kind of random. Poor guy. Yeah. He needed a better print house with better engravers, woodcutters.
It's actually really interesting. His engraver. We're gonna do a special episode at some point on his engraver, because he is quite the character. He was a very eccentric man. He had a dual personality for when he was doing business, and then for when he wasn't doing business, he would go out and basically just go out and read these mythical allegories in the street and sort of pontificate about his ideas on humanism, and was this very verbose character. He even had a name for his character that he would assume. Whoa. And yeah, he is quite the interesting fellow.
All right. We gotta stay focused here, though.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear that one.
All right. How did the art of writing about fencing evolve over time?
Yeah, so we've touched on this a little bit. I think part of what we see is this movement from books that you're writing in order to remind your students of stuff that you already did in class, things that are more exemplary. So, okay. Let's remember we're going to have this guard name that, the Unicorn Guard, and it helps you remember what it's supposed to look like. And the book is also a way to remember that and reinforce it. I think not within our tradition, and I'm not like a Meyer scholar by any means, but Meyer is just very, very intentional about the way that he approaches print in some ways that I think show how the discipline is changing through time and changing as the readership changes, because Meyer talks about how people need to have things organized. And so print becomes this way to organize ideas. And that's the chief benefit of that medium. But I think that you have this movement from this more exemplary model where you're remembering things, you're moving through postures, to more of this abstracted mathematical model, and that we see beginning with Agrippa and then moving into like the 17th, 18th centuries. And part of this is, I think, because fencing as a discipline, fencing as being a fencing master as a profession, is reinventing itself in some ways. So by appealing to underlying mathematical principles, then you're saying, hey, this is actually something you could study at a university. This is a kind of knowledge that is classy knowledge. It's not like
Right.
it's not like how to bake a loaf of bread, right? It's not like this is a kind of knowledge that's really elevated. So I think there's a push among many of the authors in the tradition to elevate the discipline of fencing with the way that they're writing, and that coupled with rising literacy, with rising usage of print technology, the broader audience that they can appeal to, really begins to change who can access these books. And of course, pretty much no one is saying, have this book, you can, Sweetenham, but Sweetenham's just kind of an opportunist. But people are not saying, take this book and learn to fence just from this book. So there's not really that expectation. You're still like learning with a master. But it does seem like more of the cognitive load, more the organizational load as time goes on is moved into language as opposed to being something that is maybe more nonverbal. Like, when you're teaching a lesson, you might check your students' closure. If you aren't there to check your students' closure, then you suddenly need a paragraph of text explaining what closure is and the angle they should be at. So some of this pedagogical work gets shifted into the linguistic realm instead of the non-linguistic realm, and then written down, and then distributed to a much broader audience, which changes the way that people approach fencing. I will say though, like I said that about audience, but I think it is interesting, like with the Degrassi translation, that makes a claim that is nowhere in Degrassi. The subtitle to Degrassi, what is it? It's like this great system of fencing where you can learn it just from this book with nobody else helping you effectively in the subtitle, and that claim is not in the Italian. So maybe
It was good enough for the English, though.
Maybe you can learn how to fence from a book. I don't know.
So then you would say then that the general trend over time was to go from something that was more concrete and learned through motion to something that was more abstract and kind of learned through reason.
I think that is how they would. I think that is how fencing folks would have seen their enterprise in the 18th and 19th century. I think one thing that's actually really interesting about fencing, though, is that it traverses this Cartesian split, and it traverses this kind of split between things that you know and things that you do in some really interesting ways. So I think there's also some subversion going on there between linguistic and non-linguistic knowledge. So I think like, especially like in the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment, that would be like a pretty accurate way of describing what somebody's trying to do with the pedagogy, with fencing, with appealing to reason, because that is academically what's going to get your discipline the most prestige in your town. It's like we are reason-based. I think now that is a little bit less, because we're postmoderns now. It's a little bit less of a sexy appeal, right? So I don't know if I would necessarily say I think that's what everyone is doing, but I think that there is this kind of interesting story of status over the last 400, 500 years with the discipline as a whole, as a profession, really starts to imagine itself as something that's bigger than like a school or two in one town. And I think that the appeal to reason is part of that larger trend.
Cool. Seems like a... You want to get the next question?
Yeah, so what do you think made people change how they fence or thought about fencing as it evolved? We see the sort of the progressive push, but from early 16th century and into the 17th century, where we see changing postures. We see a lot of the tactical paradigms start to change, and obviously from a written portion we see a change as well. What do you think sort of drove that?
Well, I mean, I think there's a few things. So, I mean, I think you could take kind of a Foucauldian approach to this, like in Discipline and Punish. Foucault's talking about like a later time period, but he talks about this movement from a more exemplary system of teaching to one that is more based on really intense, minute classification. And I think that we do in general, probably a little bit earlier than what he's talking about, see that that movement from the exemplary to that really like classical fencing, right? It's about classifying things. It's about trying to be very specific in the way that you talk about actions that you can take, the reasons why you're doing things. So I think that we have that general movement historically, that kind of epistemic shift historically. At the same time, we have changes in invention. So I mentioned already the printing press. So that new invention also begets this whole like change in rhetorical invention and inventive practice. So with rhetorical invention, it's less about discovering something new, like a scientific discovery, and more about arrangement. So invention is the first of Cicero's 5 canons of rhetoric. So with the changes to technological invention, we see changes to rhetorical invention, which also leads to like these different sorts of approaches to pedagogy, and it really makes people who are trying to it promotes failure and invention building on top of the failure in some new and interesting ways, I think.
So go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I was going to kind of edge into a little bit of conspiracy theory here. Yeah. So I wanted to, I find it interesting with something like the Anonimo Bolognese. We have something that I think no editor early on with an early iteration of the printing press probably would have touched, because of the sheer amount of information that he provides. So do you think that in some way there was even an aspect of limitation from the early printing press, and like what we see with Manciolino, where it's very condensed, it's even like a smaller book, and that probably helped to keep printing costs down and things like that, where as printing became more efficient, we see an evolution and a growth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I think that with the press becoming more efficient, you have less room, like engraving technology also gets better, right? And so you have less room, and people still complain about it all the time. They complain about their engravers. They're like, don't look at these engravings. They're terrible. Just read the text. But they actually get better. They get more accurate, and you actually do have more tools to try and get around the problem of imparting something that is time-based and motion-based through this this textual medium, which is not at all.
So something that I was thinking about when you were talking about the last point, Dori, was the trend towards what you might call intense micro-classification. Wouldn't that be more suitable for when you're learning a specific weapon, whereas in the case of the Bolognese art, for example, the truths were supposed to basically hold across a broad variety of weapons, because you didn't know exactly what you would have to hand or what the situation would be. Whereas in like something like modern fencing or modern classical fencing, you pretty much know what the environment is going to be, and you can kind of make rules, or you can study your fencing in such a way that it promotes that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And in some ways it's a little bit hard to answer because we just don't have the same detailed kind of information coming out of 16th century Bologna that we do out of 19th century Germany, 20th century Italy. I do think that there are the 3 fundamentals of fencing: tempo, modo, misura. I think classical fencing tends to drill down, or this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but when I talk about like hyper-classification, I'm really thinking about modo or technique. So when we can move a lot of things into the linguistic realm that gives us flexibility to describe some very complicated things in some very specific ways, oriented around a very specific ideal. So in some ways, the printing press enables this sort of linguistic offloading that then enables, I think, some more complexity in the kinds of actions that are being taught. So I would say that, yes, there probably is more of a drilling down into the modo, into the technique, with some of what's going on. I can't really speak to, say, like modern Olympic style fencing. I'm not really well versed in those kinds of training situations. But at least with a lot of the more modern classical sorts of pedagogical approaches, that's something that's really emphasized. Whereas what I see, at least,
Whoa.
Speaking of time and motion, I just knocked my chair into a screen, but
good save.
Full awareness. Yeah.
Quick reflexes there.
There we go. I caught it.
Good use of tempo.
Yeah. No, but I think with the Bolognese text, to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, because I don't, like I said, I don't really practice the Bolognese arts as much. But it seems like there is like this real emphasis on footwork that you don't see as explicitly anywhere else in the tradition that early, and really anywhere else for a pretty long time in the rest of the Italian language tradition. And so that emphasis on footwork makes me think that they're drilling more into the misura, the tempo of these actions. So I don't know if that's a fair generalization to you, but that's kind of my immediate response.
Yeah, I think so. From my overall pedagogical view of the Bolognese system is definitely that, and Manciolino kind of mentions this when he talks about tempo. I've always kind of wondered about his discussion on tempo and its simplicity, where he's talking about, the moment your opponent's sword passes past your person, that's the moment to strike, kind of thing. It just seems way too simplified. You look at somebody like Della Gocche, and it's a lot more complex. He gives you 5 tempos. You look later and you get a really great explanation of tempo from a lot of different people. But in looking at the simplicity of it, I think that there is a level of sort of forward and offline footwork overall in the Bolognese system, where if you take another section from Manciolino's discussion on his basic principles, when he tells you to basically always defend going forward, and that what I think that sets up is a lot of sort of a push into mezzospada, and when your opponent denies you measure, then you get the tempo of their foot and the tempo of their step, and you start to unlock all of Della Gocche's tempos, and then you can exploit those things and so on and so forth. So I do see where like their focus on footwork and their focus on sort of moving forward in that progression or offline to make parries, to change the line as you're making parries, really kind of comes into play.
Do you feel like space and place are more important organizational principles with the Bolognese authors than tempo? Because I feel like you can make a case that in some of the German and English fencing traditions, they really tend to talk a lot about positionality, so your space, almost more than they would talk about timing and timing patterns.
Yeah, I think angle is really the key to unlocking Bolognese swordsmanship. Most of the action seems to be about either moving away from the bind to create that angle, or moving in to use your body to gain the control of their sword that way. And tempo seems to be more like just do the thing that's the fastest. Because a lot of it is going to be used, it's meant more to be used with an offhand weapon, so that changes the timing a lot.
Yeah, and I think like with the later rapier tradition, you see tempo much more as a way to talk about opportunity in these really nuanced ways. And it seems like what you're saying is that space and place and positionality become more of a way to talk about opportunity with the Bolognese text. Is that fair?
Yeah, and
I think so.
Yeah, and the net goal is sort of assumed that you're going to cross their weapon and then find some way to kick them in the balls or pull, rip the weapon
just
from
like
their
today,
hand. Yeah, exactly. So
I taught my students that last week.
Instead of all this, find that little moment to stab them, which is a little bit dicey, the safest way is just, if they don't have their weapons, then you do, then you won. And now you can really safely take them out.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because the Anonimo goes into this in quite a bit of depth when he talks about the crossings, and when he talks about Stretta in particular, he talks about how you never want your sword to be found unless it's greatly to your advantage, right? And I think of like later rapier sources or earlier rapier sources, but later as in from the 16th century context later, and the idea of sort of a obligation, right? And a lot of the tactics from there being built off the idea of obliging somebody to do something like a cavazione, and you're taking advantage of that tempo that they're giving you from that obligation that you've given them. When you use, again, your angulation or a find or something along those lines to sort of force them into that. And we still see, early example of that with somebody like Manciolino, where he gives, his stringere of space, and he is limiting through tempo, he is limiting the potential actions that your opponent can give, right? Because with their sword low and a low guard, if they were to try to give a cut, they're going to give you a big tempo by raising their hand. And you can take advantage of that because you are creating that tempo. So it's there. It's definitely there. And like Marozzo talks about this too. There's I'm forgetting the Italian right now, but there's the concept of rising and falling that Marozzo talks a lot about, where you just sit in Porta de Ferro and you basically do a false edge parry and a mandrito back down constantly, and he does
Alza e tira.
Yeah, Alza e tira, that's exactly it. Yeah, and so he does it he doesn't just do it with sword and dagger. I think he does it with sword and buckler as well.
He does it with everything.
Sword and small buckler. He really incorporates it in a lot of different things, but he evolves that idea later on in Book 3, and we can talk about why Marozzo is a terrible writer. In Book 3, he actually clarifies the whole intention of this entire thing.
By the way.
Yeah. I keep telling you to do this thing, but this is actually how you do it.
So this is probably a great time to segue into the next question then.
Yeah. So I'll finish this point, and then we can kind of move on. But it's interesting because what Marozzo ends up telling you is that you should always be attacking into your opponent's attack. And that's something that Manciolino talks about too. And, that fits very well with at least my reading of what we see with Endes in the German tradition. And it's not too dissimilar from what you see with Endes. So I think that there are definitely correlations there, but when you look at an author like Viggiani, Viggiani goes through great lengths to describe what tempo is, and I think the principles are there. It's just you're right, from a literary perspective, they don't quite give it as much focus, but it just exists almost as if it's like it's a known that you should already be familiar with as you're kind of like getting into the material.
So, now that we have your background, from a literary perspective, rated from 1 to 5, who are the best and worst authors among the extant sources we have? Okay, and here's a cheat. We can already know that Marozzo is going to be the worst. So you don't have to include him.
I thought about this question. I'm probably the wrong person to ask this to, because I'm so drawn to like abject failure on the part of authors, because I'm so interested in audience. So I just wrote this whole monograph about all the plays with bad plots. So Titus Andronicus or As You Like It, they both have notoriously bad. I'm doing scare quotes, which people can't see because it's a podcast. But anyway, they have these bad plots, like nothing happens for these entire 3 acts, and then bam, everything happens all at once. Or nothing happens, okay, people get married, right? So I'm really drawn to things where there seems like a mismatch between what the goal was and how I as the audience receive it. Because sometimes, the author is just not doing a good job, and that's why they're presenting something to me and I don't like it. But sometimes they're presenting something to me or they're presenting something to a different imagined audience, and I'm not in that audience, and then it looks like a failure to me, but maybe by some standards it's not really a failure. So when I was thinking about this, I was trying to think about all like the bad fencing manuals. But in each case, I keep thinking about interesting things that they are specifically doing, even while they're not doing exactly what I want them to do.
Right.
I think you guys mentioned on a previous podcast that you think Marozzo really needs an editor because very, very, yeah. So there is certainly like on the level of just facility with written language. some people who are better than other people. But, we're talking about Vigiani, and he's, I think, one of the, I don't know, like, tragicomic prime examples I can think of for this, because people liked him enough, during the 16th century, late 16th century, so there's a couple of printings of the book. And it seems like there's all of this work that went into making the book reader-friendly. So there's like 30 pages of that coperta in the beginning, where it's just going through like every single thing, but it's utterly useless. Like, it's not really a very good, it's not a very useful meta text, right?
Right.
And that's not in the manuscript edition. So that's something that was something in the print edition that got added. But it is just kind of like a little bit, sad to me to see how Vigiani is going through and he's adding all these marginal glosses, and he wants to really make sure that you understand the main point of what Rodomonte and Bocca di Ferro are talking about. And for today's audience, I mean, have you ever really read somebody who likes books 1 and 2 of Vigiani?
No. Does anybody bother to read them?
No, they don't like them. But they're actually great books, and they're super important, because what he's doing there, to go back to a point that Joshua just made, is they are establishing the role. They're establishing this domain of knowledge around time and motion, war, and so through this sort of like discussion in the first couple of books about letters and arms, or soldiers and scholars, et cetera, et cetera. It's really arguing that there is this domain of knowledge around timing and around motion and deception that is really laid claim to by both disciplines, by the sword and the pen. And so there's this whole like kind of epistemological framework that he is developing that, to me at least, is something that we should pay attention to, or we should know about, because it's going into these questions about, these theoretical questions about time and motion and deception. And I don't think that those are tangential to fencing theory and practice. I think that they're integral to the system in some way, and they should be integral to how we approach historical fencing instruction.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So I guess it's a little bit less interesting to us because we have an entirely kind of different and frankly better idea of time than of how to conceive of time than they do. And so
I think that's where
it's like somebody's trying to sell us on astrology or something like that.
No, I mean, I don't think that's where I was going, because I think too, like, one thing that's very interesting about these texts is they're at this pre-Cartesian moment, but they're thinking really, really hard about the relationship between your body and your mind. And they're doing it in these ways that are not really inflected by what's now, frankly, kind of a discredited, strong dualism. So people today who are working in cognitive science are not Cartesians. They're not thinking in those same frameworks. They're actually closer. If you think about active externalism, or if you think about Chalmers and Clark, and these people who are working cognitive science today, they're probably a little bit closer to some of these fencing authors than they are to somebody like Descartes. And isn't it a shame that we don't have Descartes' fencing treatise? I would have loved to see how Cartesian that would have been
awful. I couldn't get to that guy in philosophy 1. I couldn't imagine a fencing treatise by that guy. Anyway, sorry. So we put you down then as Vigiani as number 1 in your book?
Yeah, everybody else is just terrible.
Okay.
No, not really. But no, I mean, I love Degrassi for thinking about judgment, and I actually love Capoferro for thinking about disciplinary divisions like around art and science, and I also love him for that kind of temporal complexity, because the way that he sets up these plates, it kind of starts where I would end a lesson. So I would end a lesson in contratempo, or in Feints in Time, and that's really like where his plates are starting. So there's just so much like condensed into each of those plays that I think is really fascinating. So I love the richness there, and I love Fabris for the way that he thinks about motion, and just for the organization, which is just better, I think, than a lot of the other early 17th century manuals that we have. I guess I was having trouble thinking of like a manual that I've read, and I just thought, oh, I wish this hadn't been written. This is terrible. This writing is so bad.
All right. Do you want to move? Should we move on to the next one, Joshua?
Yeah, sure. We can.
All right. This one's a softball. All right. So you were recently in Bologna, and sadly, neither Joshua nor I have had the chance to go there. So tell us about it. What's it like being there?
Oh, Bologna is really, really a great city. So it's really centrally located. You can like do a day trip to Milan or to Rome from Bologna. It's got this. It's very affordable, I think, in comparison to some of the other cities. But it's got this very compact, sort of historical downtown center, and of course, the food is just amazing. I was there just for a brief time. There was a conference there for the American Association of Teachers of Italian Studies. So I was there at that conference, and then while I was there, I got a couple days to go to the Archivio di Stato, which is where they keep all of their city documents. So I highly recommend the city. Do you want me to talk some about the Archivio di Stato?
Yes, that sounds awesome.
Yeah, so it's very intimidating, honestly. So it's not like, if you've been to the Newbury and you just walk in and they're so friendly and they're like, here's the catalog, here's all the stuff that we have, and you can search by keyword, and it's pretty accessible. They're very professional at the Archivio di Stato in Bologna. They're very professional. They're very, very organized. So I had this kind of stereotype in my head, like, oh, okay, I'm going to go there and it's going to be so disorganized. I'm going to have to, try to find everything. But the amount of information that's there is just profound. So I think probably if you want to visit it, the best way to go about it is to find somebody else who has been there and has written about it and who has looked at a specific busta, a specific collection, and then see where that is. Because when you go there and you can ask for like a few items a day. They have a limit on how many things a day you have. So if you're only there for a few days, it can be kind of heartbreaking because you might have asked for the wrong busta, or you start looking at it and it quickly becomes clear that, and that's okay, that's one of your 3 or 4 for your day. Yeah.
Oh, just got to give them a couple ducats under the table, I guess.
I should have tried that. But I think they have, you have to be on site to use it, but they have a computer that has an index of all the births. So one thing I was trying to track down was some more verification about when Vigiani was born, because we have this one reference in that 1901 newspaper article that's very precise. It's like, oh yeah, Vigiani, who was born on the 1st of December, 1517 or whatever it was. And that's the only place I've been able to find that kind of biographical information about Vigiani. And pro tip, they spell it Visani in a lot of these documents too, like the older ones. They have a soft, it's like that soft pronunciation. I think it's more Venetian.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to look for all the different ways you can spell his name. Yeah. So
it's
anyway,
like going through Sanudo.
Yeah.
So you can look through this index and you can see all the records of people who were born, when they were born, and then there's a reference code. And then if you have more time, you could use the reference code to get more documents. But I mean, it's really well organized. It takes a lot of preparation to go, and it's really, it's worth going to. I think I was looking at the Bocca di Ferro family collection, and that was super interesting. A lot of illegitimate children, so many legitimation documents, and they're all little novels. But I thought it was interesting to put some real flesh and bones on these characters who can kind of come across, I think, when you're reading Vigiani as perhaps being a little bit more, at least if you're reading in the 20th, 21st century perspective, as being more archetypical, because it's Bocca di Ferro, it's Iron Mouse, the philosopher, and it's Rodomonte, from Orlando Furioso. So it seems like they could be archetypes, but actually these families just have such deep roots there. I was really just, I was kind of blown away by the hyper-localism of the book. After I was in Bologna, okay, wow, it's talking about these really big themes, but it's really a very local story.
Oh, that's really interesting. Can you expand on that a little bit? Give us a little bit of a background on his muses and how they kind of relate to Vigiani and the city of Bologna?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably not going to be able to talk about, say, like all the condottieri and all the historical biographical details of folks. My emphasis is much more on design and rhetoric. So when I go and I look at these records, I'm interested in the bibliographical material, but really only as it supports some of the other work that I'm doing on the history of technical communication. But I do think that the yeah, I think, like I said, the prominence of the family is you can really see just physically through the size of the collections that are represented there, and so that's something that really startled me, or was really very interesting to me. But I know that you guys have done a lot more work on these networks of emperors and kings and princes and condottieri, so you could probably speak more than I could to how those figures all interconnect.
Yeah, sometimes it gets a little chaotic.
Yeah, they're all related. That's the weirdest part. Like, oh, yeah. Well, this guy's a second cousin. Is that really considered related at this time? You know, it's interesting. Yeah. Right now our focus is on this duel between Hugo Popoli and Guido Rangoni, who are, I think, second or third cousins.
Yeah, they all seem to connect in some way. But
go ahead. One
of the things so you kind of alluded to this, but I think I remember this in our conversation when we were at Surfo together, and we were talking about Vigiani. So they actually compile everything by family. Is that correct? In terms of like how they set up their organization?
Well, I mean, it can vary. So the one that I was interested in, there was like a collection that was donated by the Bonzi family, and so it's under Bonzi, and then within Bonzi you have like carte that specify the keyword or the family, like within that. So, kind of.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
Cool. Oh, we got to get there. Just got to figure out how to talk the missus into, hey, honey, you want to spend a vacation in Italy while I'm off at the library, right?
Well, I mean, that's the great thing about Bologna. She could go wherever she wants. Quick train ride. She wants to spend some time in Venice. Pretty easy.
Yeah, I'll have to work on her on that.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so where are we at now?
All right, so
questions.
Now we're gonna talk a little bit about Vigiani. So you're currently working on Vigiani, and he's kind of the muse that inspired Stephen and I's recent forays into studying the history of the Italian wars, and really why this whole thing with Guido Rangoni and Ugo Popoli started. Vigiani lauding them with his praises as being tremendous fencers, and all the names that he ties to the city of Bologna.
So much name dropping. So much name dropping.
Yeah. Through it's been insightful because we have found the connections that link all these people into the city of Bologna, which has been really, really fascinating. But what can you share with us about the life of Angelo Vigiani that you've kind of discovered, and what about him as a writer has kind of captured your imagination?
Yeah, so like I said, like the biographical details are still fairly sparse for him. I do have this one reference that talks about the one thing it says about Vigiani is a very specific birth date, which it doesn't give to anybody else in the article. The article is from 1901, and it's about it's about the history of fencing in Bologna by somebody who's arguing that that Bologna really gave birth to Italian fencing. It didn't come from Spain, because I guess like in the early 1900s they thought maybe that it came from Spain, and they didn't have that same kind of understanding of the tradition. So anyway, this is a journalist who's writing in honor of a big fencing event that's happening in Bologna at the turn of the century. And he's like, okay, well, here is this is where Marozzo lived, and this is what we know about. And it's just really, it's like one page, really brief. And then the one thing he mentions about Vigiani is he was born to Michel, and it was on this date. So it's just, and that he was a successor of Marozzo. So
cool.
It's very sparse. But I think in terms of what inspires me about Vigiani, I think that just his sheer chutzpah inspires me. I mean, here's somebody who's, if it's true that he's born in 1517, he's not really all that old in 1551, 1550, 1549, whenever he's writing Lo Schermo. And he's he's making these huge claims about how knowledge works and how disciplines should be organized, and why fencing is a way to think about these larger questions and these just kind of big epistemological things. And he really, before Agrippa, derives this really brilliant guard system that I actually kind of like. I kind of wish like that had stuck instead of Agrippa's, honestly, because now, you know, when we're teaching like rapier, it's like, all right, have your hand position in second, or be in a guard.
Yeah, exactly. In second, but not quite in second. Yeah. It's,
So I mean, I think in short, it's like, because my current project is on invention, and I think Viggiani is just an incredible inventor. And he's really inventing in this new medium, and I think he gets less credit than he deserves because it's of the posthumous publication. So in some ways, you know, even William Gogler does this in History of Fencing. Gogler talks about Viggiani as being somebody who wrote in 1575, but he wasn't. Right. You know, he was somebody who was writing a quarter century before then, which places him before Agrippa. And I think some of the credit that Agrippa gets for being first in certain areas really should go to Viggiani, but he's under-recognized.
Yeah, I agree. And he died so young. He's 34, I think.
I mean, if that birth date is right, have you found like anything else that like validates that 1517 date?
No.
Yeah, that's going to be my next trip, because I got the index. I know like what I need to look at now, but I just need to go back and actually look at it. Or let me know if you go, and I'll send it to you, and you can like look it up and share it with me.
So what do you think? Do you think he died trying to use his perfect Scarmo and finding out that it doesn't work in a real sword fight? So he's trying to do the thing, and somebody drops a Tramazzoni right onto his sword and nails it.
I mean, he was very adamant about fencing with sharp swords.
Yeah. Maybe one of the people he is sucking up to just got tired of like how long the compliment was going on. Just grabbed him.
Viggiani always kind of makes me think of somebody who's really into Bitcoin. He's like the equivalent to like, you should sell all your possessions and transfer everything into Bitcoin.
I first started working with Viggiani maybe like 15 years or so ago. I went to this language school in Verona that was fantastic. And I had an individual teacher, and she would work with me through the manuscript.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was so cool. But she was just laughing her head off, because it's just like, she's like, oh my God, Rodamonte, you're still going on about Bocca di Ferro? This is... You can barely get through pages, because it's just so funny, like how at length these things are. Yeah, it's obsequious. I don't know, like, don't take this the wrong way, but it also feels very like Bolognese to me, because you have these really like long ornamental things going on linguistically, and you kind of also have that, I feel like, in your art, at least when you're out of distance. Like, clearly there's intentionality and everything, but when you're out of distance, on the level, I would say that a Bolognese author will have you doing more fancy things.
Well, yeah, you got to impress the chicks when you're out of a distance.
You got to
make sure that they're all watching you, and then you go in.
Well, I mean, I think it's a different model of masculinity, right? Because it used to be that, I think with these earlier texts, you see masculinity asserted via spatial control, and the spatial control is exerted with some of these like big movements and these kind of intimidating movements and taking up room. Right. When you get to Capoferro, I think there's more of an aesthetic of minimalism, and more of an aesthetic of like each movement needs to be very carefully planned and used. Like, he's really, really particular about how stillness can be a tempo, or how when you move can be a tempo. Like, he's really particular about when and where you move. I think in a way that probably aligns a little bit more with how we would teach within more of like that classical paradigm. Like, we really want the motions to be intentional. And it's not like the earlier models weren't intentional, but I think that there's just kind of a different cultural aesthetic going on there too.
Could totally be the case, yeah. Sweet, yeah.
I think, you know, one of the things that, and you and I had talked about this before, but we can highlight it now. But I think the beautiful thing, and you definitely touched on this, is that, you know, especially with the changes that Viggiani made. He becomes almost like the Rosetta Stone of the Bolognese system, in that he clarifies things that were, especially from somebody like Marozzo in particular, where you might have something that is seen as jargon to somebody looking back on the text itself, right? Like, it's hard to understand a lot of jargon, why a specific guard is named the way that it is, and what the context is that actually illuminates the nature of the guard itself, where Viggiani just gives you the nature of the guard, with Porta de Ferro being Guardia Defensiva Perfecta, and the whole idea is it's the perfect defensive guard, and you can get that through nuance in Marazzo and Manciolino, but Viggiani just says, forget the nuance, forget having to explain it to somebody, let's just name it what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also brings me back to the question of audience. So is he like really good at analyzing his audience, or is he absolutely terrible at analyzing his audience? Because I think with Manciolino and Marozzo, maybe we're not their audience, but also maybe they just aren't good at understanding what their reader needs to hear from them to be able to make sense of the system. And with Viggiani, I think it kind of fits in with his whole just sort of just like the chutzpah that he demonstrates through these kind of crazy inventions, these crazy like linguistic inventions and the innovations that he's making. I mean, he doesn't care. I'll be like, this is what this is. This is what this is. So there's something that's kind of bold about that, I feel like.
Do you think that he was doing that because he was writing for a foreign audience? Do you think that he was writing for the court of the Holy Roman Emperor?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about that before, but that could make a lot of sense, right? Because then he would need to be much more descriptive. And also that would be kind of a nice place for that sort of three-way conversation, because I think we see people, the dialogue format becomes really, really popular later in the 16th century. He's very early with it. And usually there's two people, right? So in Saviolo, you've got Luke and Saviolo talking to each other. But you don't usually have like that kind of three-way conversation.
Right.
And in some ways it reminds me of Castiglione, because Castiglione was also working in a very popular conventional format of having this sort of like Platonic dialogue, but he treats it more like a masque or a play, because he brings in like something like 32 speaking parts. And so he's doing this really interesting formal experimentation with having lots of different voices in there. And I think in some ways Viggiani's also experimenting with that dialogue format by introducing like that third person, and that can make a lot of sense if he's trying to appeal to a foreign audience, as you mentioned. It's a way to clarification and also to ornament it.
Yeah, I'm onto an interesting connection that I'm trying to make, where the engraver of Marazzo's 1568 edition mentions that Emilio Mariscotti, or I think he says Emilio Mariscotto, was one of Marazzo's students. And the Mariscotti at this time actually end up, I think it's either Emilio or his brother, end up marrying a daughter of Maximilian, or not Maximilian, excuse me, of Charles V, an illegitimate daughter of Charles V. And I'm
some social climbing for them there.
It is, yeah. Well, yeah, it is for sure. But there's also the connection with the Farnese, where they had also married into that family. And the Farnese family in 1508, after 1506, when the Bentivoglio were kicked out of Bologna, usually there was sort of a sponsor family of the University of Bologna. And in 1508, the sponsorship is basically opened to the general, populo, if you want. And the Mariscotti, the Malvezzi, and the Farnese are the ones who are kind of vying for control of the university. And the Farnese are the ones that actually end up getting control of the university. So I don't know if there's some sort of a tie there that kind of like drives that link up, where perhaps he had some sort of relation to somebody who had that connection in the court, and therefore that was sort of his means of getting it there. But I don't know. I was kind of touching on a few different threads. It was pretty interesting. But when I was looking for this, it was because I went back and I was looking through. There's a really interesting article that was written in 1900, I think, where a gentleman ended up going back and creating a list of all of the notable instructors at the University of Bologna. And I was like, okay, well, this is interesting, because there's always kind of been this like theory that in some way the Bolognese fencing tradition has been related to, the university in some way. And the way that the university was structured is that it was actually operated less like how we see a conventional university today, and more of a sort of a mentorship program where you would have, like, you could choose a trade, and then you would basically go and work with tradespeople in that profession, and you would earn a degree. And so it was deeply rooted with the guilds and the I think it's the Note. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but it was like the four main guild structures of Bologna, where you had, I think it was law, wool merchants, silk merchants, and something else that I'm forgetting. But those are basically like the four key guilds, and if you were in one of those four key guilds, or one of those sort of like higher arts, if you will, then you were considered nobility within the city of Bologna. But the reason I bring that up is because I was looking for different names of Bolognese masters, and I found Filippo Dardi listed, and I found you were mentioning that the Bolognese system has kind of, or at least there's always been this argument around whether or not Bolognese fencing was influenced by Spanish fencing. And in this, I found another article that was written about Filippo Dardi, where this guy basically says that all the scholarship that's ever been done that links Filippo Dardi to being Spanish is completely wrong, and brings up a whole bunch of records of the Dardi family existing within Bologna. So I thought that was actually super interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And now that you mention that, the newspaper article that I was telling you about also talks some about the university system there. Now I have to go back and read that and see what the point of that was. But it goes into detail about how, I think it was Dardi talking about how he negotiated to have a position as a reader and to draw the salary from the University of Bologna.
Yep, and he was there for quite a while. I mean, I think it's something like 20 to 40 years. I had a discussion with that about, I think with Michael Chittister, and there's some question about whether or not, it was with Greg Millet. There's some question as to whether or not, because of the time that the two Dardis, because there's Lippo Dardi and then there's Filippo Dardi, and that's where the sort of the disconnect comes from. And what other scholars have kind of looked at is they're saying either that's the same person or it's two different people altogether. And so what this one scholar was arguing is that I think there were two later sources that reference it being two different people, and that Lippo Dardi had come from Spain. And what he's arguing is that Filippo Dardi had actually spent that long of a time, almost like 40 years, at the university teaching, which is pretty wild. So, yeah. All right, so let's keep going through here. I kind of drove us offline a little bit there with that.
It's an interesting segue.
It was, yeah. So, because you recently earned a certification, you can clarify on this because I think I'm getting this wrong, but a master's certification in fencing, is that correct?
Yeah, I went through the Sonoma State University's Fencing Master's Certificate program. I think that was like 2019. Yeah, it was before COVID, so 2018 or 2019.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you're, without a doubt, a better fencer than both Stephen and I.
I wouldn't say that.
So, given your extensive fencing background, I mean, we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but how do you view Viggiani as a source, in terms of like a truly, strictly just a fencing source?
Yeah, I mean, just as a fencing source, I think there has been some really good material on Viggiani written, especially in the way that he treats biomechanics, so like where you put your weight, some of those details around specifically turning your body, shifting weight, profiling, that I think we don't really get from other sources in that time period. So in that sense, I like Viggiani a lot as a fencing source. However, I have to be honest and say most of my interest is in those kinds of larger questions of knowledge and how fencing as a profession kind of gets cast and as something that is more admirable, something that's more elevated. So I think like those philosophical questions are more where I've really put a lot of my time, because we have a lot of really talented people looking at book 3 of Vigiani, but I think that bringing book 1 and book 2 back and uniting those big questions into like this very targeted application is going to be enriching long term.
Do you have any plans to translate book 1 and 2?
Oh, I have a translation. I just haven't. I want to make it like a critical edition. And so I need to it just needs a lot of work. It's one of those projects. It hasn't quite made it to my front burner yet.
That's fantastic. We'll definitely look forward to that. Yeah. It's really great. So from a pedagogical perspective, how important do you think it is for practitioners of the Bolognese arts to study their successors? And who among the 16th to 18th century rapier masters would you say is quintessential reading for anyone looking to kind of expand the scope of their study?
I think coming from that perspective, I might look first to Marcelli, who's like late 17th century, because he's somebody who really encompasses a lot of rapier practice, but he condenses it down to, I wouldn't say condense, because
that's an interesting choice of words.
He clarifies it, I think, in a way. So he's still very much a product of his own school, but I think he's somebody who does a lot of synthesis work, and you can also see him in conversation with all of these other fencing masters. Like, he doesn't really distinguish between somebody who published a book 10 years ago and somebody who published 100 years ago. Like, he's just in the first section of his book, he's just talking to everyone. So I think he's a great connecting point for someone who's interested in looking at rapier, both because there's a lot of just conceptual clarity, there's a lot of detailed description around modo, around the technique, and also because he himself is self-consciously inserting himself into this longer tradition in some ways that lets you transport what you know about one part of Italian fencing into like another part of Italian fencing. So I think that synthetic approach can be really helpful as you're trying to transfer knowledge between two different areas. So yeah, I might start with him. I think then depending on your interest, you might go backwards a little bit and look at some of those masters who he is maybe condensing or riffing off. But that would be where I would start.
That's awesome. So Marcelli.
He's a tough read.
Is he?
Yeah, it's a little bit, I think, like the waterboarding equivalent of a text.
Do you feel like the sections are too small, or like what do you?
No, it's just more the. I read a translation which was a very good, and I'm convinced is an extremely faithful translation, and so it's kind of written in a style that's opposite to what we're used to in the Bolognese, which is like stand here, do this. He does this, do this, and then do that. It's very long-winded and philosophical.
Interesting.
I think we're just a little closer to the Middle Ages in our Bolognese study, and just like, he's got a sword, you've got a sword, do something. Wait for something to happen, and then get him.
I think it's a artifact of technical communication that Marcelli is very interesting, because I think that he's really refined how he uses headings and subheadings and how he divides the book into sections. Okay. So I think like organizationally, he's a very strong source.
Cool. I'll take another crack at him.
Is there a good translation that you recommend?
Yeah, Chris Holtzman has one. That's the one that I use when I don't feel like working through it in Italian. I'm a slow reader.
That can be good and bad, right? Sometimes it slows you down so you're not skipping over details, but then sometimes you just need to kind of burn through parts.
Yeah, if there's a translation available, a lot of times I like to start with the translation, and then when I get to something that seems weird or interesting, then I switch to the Italian so I can focus in on just that part.
That seems like the best way to do all of this stuff. Yeah, this all makes sense. Wait, that doesn't make sense. I bet there's a boo-boo here. Or something really weird.
I'm sure about that. Yeah, there's something that doesn't quite fit with the ecosystem.
Yeah.
A missing footnote. So what about modern fencing? When it comes to like foil or saber, what lessons can people focused on historical martial arts take from modern fencing and its conceptions to better understand the historical sources?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm going to have to talk more about classical fencing as modern fencing, so fencing with modern weapons, because I think with Epee 2.0, there's been a turn back towards a little bit more simplicity with a lot of training, broad strokes. I mean, obviously at a very competitive level, you're doing very, very complicated things. But there's not as much of an emphasis on technique, so just like to bracket that there. But speaking of, say, stuff that is rooted in pre-electrification, but it's still using modern weapons, I think that's kind of the sweet spot there, because this comes out of the Enlightenment period and the Classical period, where people are very interested in classifying things down to these very granular levels, which means that you have a lot of precision in how you can describe bodily movements and how you can get at things pedagogically. So if you're interested in teaching, it's a really nice place to start, because there's an answer for literally any question. So where should my hand be? How far should my hand be rotated? How should I stand? Like, what do I do if my student makes this mistake? Like, there's like an answer for everything. So it's a pretty nice. Archive. Is very comprehensive. Classical modern fencing, I think it's a really big umbrella term. I think specifically for the school that I'm from, so the Sonoma State School, which came out of the San Jose State Fencing Masters program that Gogler founded in 1979, we tend to focus on, I think, aggression and intent. So more so than, say, like grace or some other hallmarks of other sorts of classical approaches that you might see. So yeah, that kind of Enlightenment approach to categorizing, describing everything in exhaustive detail is very helpful if you're trying to learn how to teach. And then also it's just hugely, hugely fun, because we ran like a foil workshop last Friday. And we went through this mind-melting lesson that Gogler wrote in like 1994. And we get through to the end, and you're doing this action. You're like, there's no way I can do this action. It's way too complicated. It's like phrases and phrases and phrases deep. And then the next action says, add to that X, Y, and Z. And then all of a sudden, you can do the thing that was too hard to do before, but now you can't do X, Y, and Z, but that's okay. But anyway, it's like, there's like a complexity there that's just hugely pleasurable for fencing and for training. So, I mean, if you enjoy that kind of thing, it's hard to get from other weapon styles, I think. The foil is just, it's so light and so small, and you can do like these triple feints, and you can do like this really precise targeting with it that I think you don't really get a chance to do as much with some of the other heavier weapons.
The old triple feint. That's that's actually. Palladini actually. That's what he tells you should do if you're ever in a serious fight. You should do the tre punta, which I guess is just a double feint.
That is terrible advice. That's the worst advice ever. They're just gonna like hit you with an arrest. Like, no, don't do that.
Yeah. So he's.
That's pretty much Mancellino's advice to all feints.
Run into them.
Go right into Guardia di Faccia. Nice feint, bro. Boom. Deal with that.
Oh, got it. Yeah. Or that's just his answer to everything is just Guardia di Faccia.
Yeah, exactly.
I think going back to that question of like classical and historical fencing, one thing that is really nice is that we have an oral tradition that can go back a lot of generations, and so there's always like artifacts of your fencing and you don't know where it came from or exactly what the intent was, and there are a lot of things that I wouldn't know, except my maestro came over to me and was like, put this part of your body here, or you're breathing wrong, or like just really really just things that don't get written down. And I think like with our tradition, it's great because we have the lineage that goes back for a long time, and then it goes back to people who were working with weapons that were heavier, and we still, like in our tradition, we treat sabers like they're heavy, so our movement is centered at the elbow. We do circular cuts from the elbow. We're really clearing a lot of room there. And again, I'm demonstrating a circular cut, I realize, on a podcast, but
It looked good to me.
That's
Looked
okay.
good to me,
Yeah.
But yeah, we're not doing things like as much from the wrist, right? And we're also a very point forward saber system. So in some ways, I think it's closer to what you all still do. So yeah, there's that kind of neat connection, the lineage, living history, the oral tradition, that in many ways I think can connect us to some of the older weapons a little bit more closely than some other fencing systems. We're not really starting from scratch in the same way. But at the same time, there's like this kind of exhaustive level of detail, which, for me right now, my work most recently has been in curriculum development and how do you teach fencing better? How do you teach historical fencing better? How do you develop lessons and students in this art? So since that's where I have been living for the last few years, that's one of the main things that I see from it. I mean, I think like you don't need it, clearly. Like if you're more interested just in like the fencing side of things or studying the historical texts, then maybe you would be better off just taking lessons in the specific weapons form that you want. But I think if you're interested in teaching specifically, it's really, really a valuable tool.
Yeah, teaching's the hard part.
Yeah.
It is.
It's a fun part too, though.
If you say so.
Eating you, and then it's really annoying.
Oh, cool. Well, speaking of teaching, why don't you take the next question, Joshua?
Sure. So I think that for me in particular, at least from my, I'm in the southeast, so we share a sphere. So I get a lot of feedback from, and I get to see you once a year down in Surfo and around, and I see students of yours and people who you and David have kind of connected with. So I've come to believe that RASP is one of the most important events in HEMA or in Western martial arts, and I think that everybody should attend. I personally haven't had the pleasure to go, but the stories that I've heard from peers have been absolutely phenomenal. So tell us a little bit about what RASP is and what its mission is.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. It's kind of my baby, so I appreciate that people are talking about it and people are enjoying it. So when David and Keith and I sat down and organized Surfo first a while ago now, some years ago, one of the things we were thinking about with Surfo was how do we bring together people from these different communities, like from the SCA, from HEMA, maybe from some like more modern fencers, but how do we bring them together to develop kind of a shared community and shared resources? That thinking is what we carried into some of our earlier, that David and I carried into some of our earlier RASP events. But what we've really been able to do with the events is focus also on a shared language. So there's this great line in Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Fairy Queen. He's like a late 16th century English author. He says, and he's talking about vernacular English as opposed to Latin, like writing literary things why you should write literary things in English and not Latin. But he talks about developing a kingdom of our own language. And I love that phrase. And I feel like with RASP, we've really been able to develop this hyper-specific, hyper just useful and applicable language, and something that was, I think, less widely known in the historical fencing community, but that has, existed for a long time. And we learn that language, and then we've gotten to share with other people, and now we're all speaking that language, and that means we can just do more complicated and interesting things together because we're using some of the same language and the same concepts. So those two things, like bringing together people from different parts of the fencing community, and then also building a kingdom of our own language, have just really been awesome, I think, for me with RASP and its mission. I think over the last few years, so we're getting ready for RASP number 6, we've actually built up enough momentum with people who have been several times before. We're able to spend less time on terminology and spend more time on pedagogy and pedagogical development. So we have some really just interesting conversations. People can come and share their research, and there's a lot of just support for other people who are coaching or running schools at across the country. And sometimes we have people come in internationally. This year we're having Francesco Loda and Silvia Tomasetti come in from Rome. Yeah, I'm really excited to have them. So that'll be kind of interesting. So they're kind of our fencing cousins in a way. So it'll be interesting to see how the language of Italian fencing translates between, Rome and Atlanta.
That's good.
We'll see how that works.
So
That's
I heard
awesome.
a funny thing that maybe this is just a made-up story, but I heard that Italian fencing is less Italian than American Italian fencing is. That it tends to more resemble French and Italian styles, and that the American style has tried to tease out more of what's pure Italian.
Yeah, I think it may depend on the school, but I know when we were in Italy, David went up and visited Maestro Turan's school, and Maestro Turan is very Italian, so his system is very, very Italian. But I know that he was talking with one of the students there who made that comment, like, oh, okay, well, your saber looks more Italian than these other, sabers. So in that way, it is really interesting, right? That there's this kind of thing that transcends language and culture. It's like these sort of like embodied remembering over generations and generations, where you can just recognize somebody who's speaking your fencing language, and that's kind of exciting.
Cool.
Yeah, that is really cool.
So I'd like to add one more question to the mix, unless you had another one, Joshua?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, hypothetically speaking, let's say it's 1525, and you have been challenged to a duel, and you take yourself to the dueling ground, and there is a giant selection of weapons, and what weapon do you elect to be the weapons for the duel, and what armor?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. What are the rules like first blood, or is this like,
No, it's to the death. Forget first blood. This isn't a foil match.
Oh, man.
This is a sword fight.
My inclination would be, because I assume that I am a 6 foot tall man who weighs 200 pounds.
Oh, no, this is you.
No, I'm saying, so my inclination, when I fence with somebody who is much taller, much bigger than I am. So I like to grab like a cutting weapon and like close distance as hard as I can and like go with the grapples when really I shouldn't. Like I shouldn't be doing that.
But it's fun. It's so fun.
But if it's actually no serious duel, I would probably take something longer and more point oriented, and like stay as far away as I could, and like run away and hit people in the hand, hit my opponent in the hands until I could close in.
So like a pole arm, you think?
Maybe not as long as that. It'd be a little bit unwieldy. It's a good question.
I fought you with sword and dagger, so I think that you should go with sword.
All right, so your second is suggesting that you take the sword and dagger.
Yeah. Honestly, sometimes when I fight sword and dagger, like at Queen's Gambit, which is another sort of Piedmont event, they have mixed bolognese arms, so you can do sword and dagger against people who are doing sword and buckler. Yeah. And so every time I do sword and dagger against somebody who's doing sword and buckler, I feel like I'm cheating.
I'm so bad at sword and buckler. That is like honestly the main thing that keeps me from doing more of the bolognese fencing, because I just hate bucklers. I hate them. They're so awkward and they're so heavy.
That's how I feel about daggers.
You can't stab anyone with them, and people get mad at you if you punch them. Yeah. So yeah, I would take sword and dagger. That's where I do a lot of my competitive training right now, because as a short person, sword and dagger is a really nice weapons form for me. And David and I have been working on Marcelli's rapier and dagger, which has some very interesting timing patterns that can surprise people just long enough for my kind of slow and aging self to to get in there and get a few hits in where I might not otherwise.
That's awesome. So to wrap this up, we've talked about RASP, but let's talk about some of the books that you have published as well. So I don't know if we can still find Fundamentals of Italian Rapier.
So that's out of print. Our publisher died, so the rights returned to us. We're actually working on a second edition of that right now, awesome. And we're thinking about maybe just publishing it ourselves, so we can have a little bit more creative control over it. Because it was nice working with a publisher with a small printing press, but there's just so many more dependencies. So we're working on a second edition for that now. So hopefully that'll be out in the next year or so.
That's great, yeah. I know our rapier instructor at our school, Rory, that was the first book that he ever recommended to me to get. So,
Oh,
that
cool.
yeah, he said that it was the best book to learn rapier. So the other one
That's
is Fencing
awesome.
Form and Cognition in Early Modern Stage, Artful Devices. What is that one about?
Oh, yeah, that was my dissertation turned into a monograph. And so
Oh, fantastic.
so I'm looking at basically how did Elizabethans transmit practical knowledge about time. And one of the ways they do that, I'm arguing, is through fencing. And I argue that these bad plot plays I mentioned earlier don't really have bad plots. They're just pulling from a structure of combat that would have been probably a little bit more understandable to people who are living in that time period. They have the skilled vision to actively interpret sequences. So, for example, like the formal logic of Titus Andronicus, I argue is drawn from like a contratempo sort of strategy of projecting weakness to draw a counterattack that you're then prepared to counter, or as you like it, is really based on a conditional if, and it talks about feints and feinting. And the very last, famous part is Touchstone talking about the degrees of the lie. So I look at all these different plays that have, bad plots, and I think about how structurally and visually, performed in embodied spaces, how they are drawing formally from fencing theory and fencing practice. Because, in that time, if you think about Blackfriars, you might have a fencing lesson going on one floor and a play going on another floor. So literally the theater in England is taking over these communal spaces where people used to be watching, bear baiting, they used to be watching fencing, right. They would take fencing lessons, and they're turning those into places for fictional representations, for the commercial theater, which is a brand new thing. Right. So literally you have that happening in the building, let's rebuild this building that used to be for fencing, now it's going to be for plays. We're going to kind of borrow some bricks and mortar from the building. We're going to borrow some techniques from these fencing masters and from these fencing lessons. So I think there's a lot of interconnection there that I tried to draw attention to.
That's right, I guess, because before that there was theater, but it was predominantly amateur theater, right?
Yeah, so you'd have itinerant theater, so people would travel around and they would go to different towns and perform, and a lot of times those were more connected to the church and to feast days, so you might, and it was also used for instruction, so you might put on a play of Noah and the Ark, but then the Shipwrights Guild would sponsor it so that they could advertise their shipbuilding skill.
Cool.
So it
cool.
was
That's great.
Different.
I love that.
There wasn't the population center to support it.
Neat.
That's awesome.
Cool.
Well, Dori, thanks so much.
Thank you.
It was great
Dori.
having you on. That was really
Yeah,
insightful.
thank you.
I
Very
appreciate it.
educational.
A chance to share my work and to hear what you guys are up to. So thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again. And that concludes another episode of Le Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast. I want to thank Dr. Dori Coblentz again for coming on and sharing her wisdom with us. We look forward to having you all for the next episode of Le Arte dell'Arme, where we're going to have Maestro Wars Episode 1, featuring the background of the duel between Ugo Pepole and Guido Rangoni. Until then, stay saucy.